Check.
Can I leave it like this? I have my laptop computer. Right. Okay, is it okay?
Where should I be sitting?
No, I think. We can have it started in a minute, so please be seated, and the panelists, please come onto the stage. Okay, I think we can go.
Hello.
We can go ahead now. Perhaps this seminar has been organized by Indian National Center for Polar and Ocean Research and Kobe University and Korea Polar Research Institute. Because we have only 2-hour time window, I think we will need to have it started right away. Today, we have the privilege of having the director of Indian National Center for Polar and Ocean Research, Dr. Tamban Melos, and he will open the event, and I will also say a few words. Then we'll go ahead with panel 1. Tamban, would you please come up to the podium, please?
Thank you, Shin. Welcome to this particular seminar, which has been planned together with NCPOR as well as KOPRI and this, the special group which working on polar activities called the Changing Antarctic and Challenges Ahead. I think we all are aware at the moment. I think, in fact, what we are discussing here is around ATCM itself is about the Antarctica is changing for good or bad, but unfortunately, it is also having a lot of impact all around the globe. And sitting in this, the coastal city of Kochi, we are much more aware, actually, the climate change is happening, the real. And even the impact of some of those things, what is happening, polar regions are ultimately impacting the extreme precipitations happening in this part of the world. So I think this is an extremely important event for us to discuss further. How do we, in this changing, it's not only just the climate is changing, but the global scenarios are changing, the geopolitics is changing. So in this situation, how do we prepare ourselves in the coming decades, how we are going to cope with the challenges? So that is what I hope this particular panel would be able to discuss further and come with ideas as fruits for our thoughts. Thank you so much once again for inviting me, and over to you, Christine.
As a matter of fact, there are 2 openers. The second one will be mine. This is Hyung-Chul Shin from Korea Polar Research Institute, and I serve as the director of the institute. One quick housekeeping announcement before I forget. This seminar will run for 2 hours until 14:30. I am delighted and honored to be in a position to address this much interested and motivated audience at the beginning of this special seminar. Antarctic is indeed a unique place. It has been since its first sighting, or even before, a land of mystery and aspiration. It is hardly comparable to anywhere else in the world, and yet highly relevant and connected to every corner of this planet. Huge changes that are taking place in many other parts of the globe are also hitting hard the Antarctic, no exception. Not only that, more players with diversifying backgrounds and interests have been coming onto the stage, and the factors involved are becoming more complicated ever. Such a time might be in the past, when it was so important for whom to go and conquer and build first, whether to mine or not, or to allow fish or not. How we deal with new challenges, and what we do today will inform and inspire the humanity as to how to manage the whole affairs tomorrow in the Antarctic and elsewhere in the future, near and far. Science diplomacy and environmental management and conflict-absorbing peaceful cooperation and whatever in the Antarctic will matter immensely. It will most probably become a touchstone and the analog of what we should be doing in remaining untrodden, unexplored part of this planet and even outer space. To facilitate a deliberation in this context, putting together right people, right topics, and good people on the table is a key starting condition. The names of the panelists today, and with the expertise and perspectives they represent, already prescribe a half success, as I believe. National Center for Polar and Ocean Research, India, Polar Cooperation Research Center, Kobe University, Japan, and Korea Polar Research Institute joined forces and put in significant efforts. At this point, I can remind you of a similar seminar organized in Helsinki at the ATCM 45 last year. Today's one is not necessarily a continuation designed purposely from the beginning. However, it certainly served as a benchmark when these three institutions joined their hands to organize it today. I need to note that any views expressed today by the participants are entirely expert opinion in their individual capacity, neither from their affiliated organization nor from the organizer. Open and free debate is an important emphasis here today, and this is why we chose to live stream the seminar. We seek a deliberation that is sound in academic terms, also with actions and follow measures in mind, ultimately. I cannot wait to hear what the panelists have to say with those who will listen to on-site and online and to discuss along with the colleagues. Let us waste no time, therefore, and have the seminar started right away. Thank you very much. So, panel one will be chaired by Professor Akio Shibata. Please, Akio.
Thank you very much. My name is Akio Shibata, Professor of Public International Law and Director, Polar Cooperation Research Center, Kobe University in Japan. So I'll be chairing the first panel, and thank you as one of the co-organizers for coming to this event. So the first panel is entitled Antarctic Governance Challenges, Climate Change, Science Diplomacy, and Diversifying Perspectives. And we have 5 experts, panelists, to share their views in 5 minutes each, and we hope to have discussions amongst the panelists first, and then hopefully we can have some interventions from the floor also. So the first panelist is Dr. Rajik Ravindra, former director of the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research, India. So what is your perspective on the current and challenges regarding the Antarctic governance? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome all the delegates, audiences here. Since we have been given only 5 minutes, so this is only an opening remark, and we do wish that and hope that all of you will join in the discussions that will follow these small presentations. Well, I begin by saying that the governance of a continent of the size of the Antarctica, which is India and US put together, by just a group of 29 countries, though having its own challenges, must be viewed as a very successful management practice that has upheld the preamble of the treaty, the Antarctic Treaty, till now. The governance has been able to keep three major things, The first is the Antarctic committed to the science, the peace, and an area of international cooperation. It has kept it free of any discord, demilitarized, nuclear race free, and above all, it's the only place on our planet which is free of crime and violence. And I think all that credit goes to the treaty and the governance. The governance has essentially been science-based, that is very important, focused on upholding a regulatory mechanism for preserving and protecting the Antarctic environment and its associated ecosystem. But friends, geopolitics has never gone away from Antarctic. And science has always been a part of this. And this is not what I say. This has been published in a very reputed journal of Nature by Simon Neyer. Many researchers believe that, and I quote, science is a tool which nations have used to maintain a presence on the continent and dominate its affairs. Though all the contracting parties, whether they are consultative status or non-consultative status, have unanimously been offering the support on the environmental issues, but on many other issues, differences are there. And we are increasingly witnessing these aspects. The main reasons, perhaps, being that the current geopolitical scene is conspicuously different from the state of 50s and 60s when the treaty was signed. The word of the former Australian Prime Minister Hawke, while using and advocating for the Madrid Protocol in place of the Convention on Regulations of Antarctic Mineral Activities, CREMAR, and I quote him, but we are challenging treaty members to accept that times have changed since 1970s. That was the sentence he used when he was advocating for the Madrid Protocol. And I must say that this sentence still holds good. They are still relevant. A new global order has taken over the historical era. The economical, technological, and strategic equations have been rewritten. New nations have since been born with new economic strength, technological capabilities, and aspirations and market. This is very important. And the new aspirations to dominate and occupy more space in the matters of Antarctic governance. The change is reflected in the structure of the ATCM. We have grown from 12 to 29, and from very meager of these 12 to now 56 parties. So that must be viewed. And apart from the developed states, developed world, we also have now the global South, Brazil, China, India, and South Africa, and several more. The modern era is the era of inclusiveness rather than exclusiveness. It dominates and it demands equality and diversity, keeping the principle of one word, one family, which we call in India, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Since 2014, no state party has come up to the status of consultative in the Antarctic Treaty, and that point must be noted. Perhaps now is the time when more representation from countries that meet the treaty requirements as contained in the Decision 2 of 2017 can be encouraged even at the risk of losing dominance of a few. Some celebrated authors still opine that the increase in the membership, heterogeneity, and asymmetry of the states in the treaty has already produced substantial changes in the equilibrium regime. Any further increase may add to the stress, and if decision-making is extended to a heterogeneous group. The challenge is, and I summarize the work of very leading authors, including Klaus Dodd, Janner, Faraday, Liggett, Hemmings, Simon, Neylor, Chaturvedi, and many others. And there are a group of about 5 or 6 challenges that should be noted, and I have 2 minutes still to go. While there is peace in Antarctic, the peace at the ATCMs is slightly, affected. It has been overshadowed by the recent confrontations. We must think that, are we heading for Group A versus Group B in ATCMs? Apart from the management of the plans of the protected areas and several measures, liability annexes, etc., which have been adopted, several measures and annexes still await the legal binding mechanism. We are still hoping that these will be approved. Discussions on several sensitive issues, and I need not quote those issues, are avoided, or what we can say are they are put under the rug. In the current resource-hungry world, the growth and the diversification of Antarctic resources and other commercial activities such as fishery, tourism, bioprospecting, they weigh very heavily on the minds of the people. Tourism by far is the most discussed issue in the ATCM. It is an educative item, but then the market for the tourism is very attractive, and it is at crossroads when we talk of the conservation of Antarctica. The impact of growing luxury tourism, adventure tourism, is very serious, and I think that is a major challenge that the countries have to face now. There exists a gap in our knowledge about the impact of climate change on the Antarctic ecosystem, and the meaningful science is becoming very, very costly, and it has gone beyond the purview of only one single nation. I'll summarize my small talk by the words of the Klaus Dodd. It's a paper that is coming up, and it is titled, "What is Antarctica?" It's coming up in the Journal Geography very shortly, and I quote him: "The determination of the future Antarctic scenario is very intriguing but complex intellectual exercise. The future is obviously hypothetical, multiple, and indeterminate. The norms, rules, and the values associated with the Antarctic Treaty are and will remain to continue to be under stress." Thank you.
Thank you, Rajik. So we'll, of course, come back when we have discussions. So next speaker is Mr. Ivan Bloom, former United States diplomat. So Ivan, what is your view on the current status and challenges of the Antarctic governance? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Akio Shibata-sensei. Good to see you. Good to see everyone, and good afternoon. And I want to thank the three organizers of this seminar, which, as you say, is similar to what some of us experienced in Helsinki. So I'm glad that you were able to organize this sort of thing once again. So I used to be the head of the US delegation to ATCMs for a number of years. And in that capacity had the opportunity to attend the ATCM in New Delhi. So this is my first time back to India since then, but it's a real thrill to be back here. Over the years, I've seen the increased interest of India in polar science and in polar diplomacy. I was able to lead 2 inspections of Indian Antarctic bases, Maitri and Bharati, in 2012. And at that time, I was able to see up close the very impressive contribution to science that India is making and is continuing to make. Now, obviously, not a lot can be said about Antarctic governance in a few minutes, but I'll just give a few thoughts. As Dr. Ravinda was suggesting, there have been changes in the Antarctic Treaty System since 1959. There were 12 original signatories, but now 56 parties and 29 consultative parties. And in that context, developing countries are making their mark. India, in particular, has invested in Antarctic science, and that's something you would expect for India as a growing and rising power. So one aspect of what we've been asked to talk about is the effectiveness of the Antarctic Treaty System. And there's certainly an awful lot to say there. It has provided for more than 60 years a framework for peaceful cooperation, in particular related to the pursuit of polar science. The treaty and its related instruments have effectively demilitarized the continent. It has managed territorial claims. It's prohibited mining and other resource extraction, and established regulatory procedures for marine conservation and fisheries management. So these are all, in general terms, rather extraordinary successes. And yet, as we all know, there are any number of challenges. Part of that relates to, well, as you know, the ATCM as well as CAMLR make their decisions on the basis of consensus, and that means it's hard to get things done, hard to take affirmative actions that protect the environment, to address shipborne tourism, and many other things. So the questions that might be asked include, is the Antarctic Treaty System doing enough to protect the environment? Is it doing enough to ensure parties are able to cooperate to conduct science, especially as related to climate change? At CAMLR, there has been insufficient progress on establishing a network of marine protected areas. Indeed, that a major effort there has more or less been stopped and needs to begin a more active phase. So is the mining ban safe in the future, even if the world comes to need critical minerals that can be found in Antarctica? How will states deal with the rise in shipborne tourism? Can Antarctic fisheries be managed sustainably? So these are all the types of issues which, in part here at the ATCM and also in part at CAMLR, are being thought about by the delegates who go to those meetings. But it also has been already been suggested, there are geopolitical factors and issues that are at play. And the question is whether countries are willing to support the Antarctic Treaty on and into the future, despite continued tensions among states, not just in the region, but globally. And there are questions about whether how the states operate their facilities, the possible dual use of technologies at those facilities, and what those sort of concerns may say. And then, can the treaty system reflect properly the interests of a diverse number of states, large and small, some with territorial claims, some not, and the varying interests of developed and developing countries. So these are all issues that are out there that I think are challenges and need to be thought about, not just in the context of ATCMs, but in a sense of broader diplomacy as well. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ivan. Okay, so then we have Dr. Susie Grant, Chief Officer of the Standing Committee of the Antarctic Treaty System in the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, the SCAR. So for Susie, what is your view on the role of science in the Antarctic governance and the challenges for Antarctic science diplomacy?
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation to join this panel. These are certainly big and challenging questions. I wanted to start by just looking at the role of science in Antarctic governance. And science, as we know, is really central and has been central from the very beginning of the Antarctic Treaty. Going right back to the treaty itself, this was recognized following the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58, leading into the drafting of the treaty itself, where in this, I think it's the second paragraph, parties acknowledge the substantial contributions to scientific knowledge resulting from international cooperation in scientific investigations in Antarctica. And that's really continued to be central to the the whole ethos of the treaty, and then later on in the protocol recognizing that the continent should be kept set aside for peace and for science. So scientific collaboration has always been really important, and that international cooperation on logistic support and coordination of activities both in the field and at institutes in all of our different nations as well. National Antarctic programs do an absolutely enormous amount of really critical research, and we see so much of that coming through to these meetings, into the CEP and the ATCM, as the basis for many of the discussions that we have here. The role of SCAR, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, which is actually predates the treaty by a year, I think. So going all the way back to that time, SCAR's role has been to coordinate science in the Antarctic. And in terms of our contribution to the treaty, SCAR's role is to provide independent and objective scientific advice. That's often in response to requests directly from the treaty parties or from these meetings, but it is sometimes also proactive, where SCAR scientists feel the need to draw the attention of parties to particular emerging issues of importance. But I think a key challenge is really the communication between the ATCM, the CEP, and the scientific community itself, and vice versa. This is a two-way communication challenge, I think. We need to be able to facilitate the engagement of scientists for them to understand what it is that the parties are concerned about, what they're discussing, what their priorities are in terms of scientific research. And I think there was many of you will remember Stephen Chown, a former president of SCAR, and he gave me once a great analogy in thinking about how we provide information as scientists, how we provide that to policymakers. And he said, you can't just take a bunch of scientific papers, throw them over the wall to the policymakers and hope that someone picks them up and reads them and understands them. And I think that's really important. We have to provide information in a more accessible way. We have to target it to the priorities that are being discussed here. And that is challenging. I think doing this in a relevant and timely way is also difficult when we have challenges of capacity. SCAR in particular is really an organization largely of volunteers. Scientists are working in their research jobs, and they're also contributing to SCAR activities, so it is difficult to find people able to devote enough time to developing this advice. It's also challenging to make sure that we draw on relevant scientific information from right across all possible sources when we're formulating our advice. SCAR works really hard to draw on expertise from across our whole range of science groups, also to try and improve the geographic scope of where that advice is coming from, the diversity of these groups, and the accessibility of those groups to all interested researchers wherever they are in the world. I think we also have a challenge to ensure that the next generation of scientists is involved. We have a number of fellowship schemes running where we're trying to make sure that we give the experience to younger scientists and earlier career researchers to understand what these meetings are about and how they can then focus research and make that more accessible. But we certainly have a long way to go with all of those challenges, I think, and it's something we all need to continue to work on. But just coming back to the theme of this panel, I wanted to go back to what's meant by science diplomacy, and I tried to see if I could find any definitions of what this means. And I think a good one is the use of scientific collaborations among nations, international organizations and non-profit organizations to address common problems and to build international partnerships. And I think the treaty system has really been trying to do that from the beginning. I think the governance model, the research collaborations have really been an example that's been followed by others in other regions of the world, other international organizations. But the big challenges facing Antarctica now really do need science diplomacy to address these common problems, these problems that are common to all of us. And it's really exciting to see this whole range of programs, initiatives which are coming forward now. The Antarctica InSync program. We now have the 5th International Polar Year in the planning stages. And all of these really kind of continue the legacy of that original International Geophysical Year and that collaboration which was the foundation of the treaty. So I think there are many, many challenges, but I'm excited for the future, and I think we can draw upon this huge diversity of expertise to address those common problems that the Antarctica faces. Thank you.
Susie. So we have Captain Juan Camilo Forero, the Director, Colombian Antarctic Program, and he will give his perspective on how a diversifying perspective and voices could be incorporated into the Antarctic governance. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you very much for taking into account Colombian Antarctic Program to be part of this panel. I'm very honored. In order to put my intervention into context, I would like to focus on 3 issues. The first, the motivation to engage in Antarctic governance. The other, how we understand Antarctic governance and how we conduct science diplomacy, and at the end, we can encourage cooperation among us. The insertion of Colombia, a tropical country that you know we have coasts in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and now we're going into the Antarctic Treaty System. This kind of challenging idea. But in Colombia, we understand it and we explain it in the basis of that we are in the ATS as a matter of survival. Our country, our biodiversity, and how to understand the Antarctica's influence in our country is very important to adapt national actions, to adapt with new ways to contribute in the scientific basis in a context of global environmental and political changes. Climate change and tropics is a very unstable mix, and we are very aware of that in Colombia. Colombia is still learning. We are really new in these matters, but we are willing to learn and will to act. From Colombian Antarctic Program, we are giving the message that we are naturally connected to Antarctica. And what happens in Antarctica doesn't stay there. It's influencing directly our country's dynamics. So we are forced to contribute with new perspectives and new knowledge. I think new views, new perspectives, and new information is needed to be provided to find new tools to solve these problems and to give the decision makers new tools to solve our common problems. You know that in this system, the ATS, there are many perspectives, many interests, many motivations, and they all come together. Science, resources, conservation, utilization of these resources, and at the end, decision making. Antarctica's treaty system was built and created by politics, is kept and maintained by politics, and it's generating new politics. But we are talking about our own survival. Antarctic governance as an integrative mechanism where science, politics, and policy enable multidisciplinary, multi-level, multi-sectoral conversations in a global scale encourages us to focus on how we best behave and provide new views over a region that's crucial to our planet and to all of us. Finally, I think new faces and new voices in the ATS, as the Colombian, should encourage us to ask or to request new actions. And I will point 3 ways. Science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. These are three perspectives that we think should be taken care of. And for closing, when we discuss the participation of new voices, I think we should focus on which are the messages these new voices provide and how. From actors to the system and vice versa, and how we could interact in a better way and through this particular governance system. The discussion is still open, and we, as new faces with new voices, are called to provide new ways to find solutions and answers to all the challenges we're facing. The question is, how are we going to give this discussion? Are we open enough to give it? Colombia is ready and engaged. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have Dr. Arnold Krellhuber, the Regional Director, the United Nations Environment Program, the UNEP. The same goes to you, Arnold. What is your view on how to incorporate diversifying perspectives and voices into the Antarctic governance? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and it's a great honor to be here. This is my first ATCM, and it's certainly very, very interesting and fascinating to follow the different processes, the different diverse views that are being made in the official part of the meeting. But speaking last, I've also benefited already from the diverse views and opinions on this podium. Look, Professor Shibata, let me say as a first point that environmental multilateralism is being tested. But it still remains the best hope for our own and the planet's future in terms of dealing with the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity and land loss, as well as pollution. And despite the many challenges and the plurality of crises that the world faces and that the international community has to address, including inflation, rising food and energy costs, and the fact that the world is still recovering from the human and economic loss of a pandemic amidst new wars, environmental multilateralism continues to deliver. At the end of 2022, the world adopted a new global biodiversity framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity. In 2023, the world also adopted a new chemicals framework that has as its ambition to address the negative effects of the most hazardous chemicals. In June 2023, the world adopted a new agreement for the conservation of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. And currently the world is on a path towards adopting an ambitious plastics treaty, following a mandate from the 5th session of the UN Environment Assembly, which is a global body dealing with environment and also these interlinkages between science, policy, and decision-making. I would say that the Antarctic Treaty System is part of these successes of multilateral action in the interest of present and future generations. And as such, it must also continue to deliver on the promises that it has made and continue to thrive as a model for this interface between science and policy that is so important in dealing with environmental challenges. Of course, the evolution of environmental governance is a very dynamic one. The Antarctic Treaty System, predates even the creation of my own organization, the UN Environment Program. Environmental governance evolves, new actors come onto the scene, new challenges arise. This is a challenge for the legal landscape that this environmental governance system operates in. But I believe that we can rise to this challenge, and the successes that I have highlighted, I think, or I hope, would not only give me hope for the future, but also all of you that are engaged in making the Antarctic Treaty regime fit for the future and fit for purpose. Polar regions and the Antarctic in particular are sending us a very clear message. And this message is that we're running out of time, that we need to act. And this message is further underpinned by science, including all the different papers that are presented, including for this meeting. I think we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to future generations to listen. I will not go into detail of all the challenges, but just to highlight, of course, since I mentioned the triple planetary crisis, number one, climate change. UNEP's latest emissions gap report paints a picture where we're still heading towards a 2.5, 2.9 degree world in this century. There is still a massive bridge that we need to build to really tailor the emissions to the ambitions that the world has agreed to in the Paris Agreement. There is still a production gap. The top 20 emitters still continue to invest in fossil fuel industries. And I believe the countries that are gathered here in the context of the Antarctic Treaty Regime have a chance to demonstrate their leadership on climate change, listening to the message that this continent says, because as Juan has also mentioned, the problems of the Antarctic are also the world's problems. And what solutions we can implement in the Antarctic will also be solutions that we can implement elsewhere. Biodiversity loss. This continent is under a severe threat when it comes to biodiversity loss. My previous speakers have already alluded to the urgency to deal with the conservation of species on this continent. And let me say that there again, the parties have an opportunity to lead on this in the context of the implementation of the global biodiversity framework, in the context of the BBNJ, the new agreement under the law of the sea to conserve biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. We have a chance now to make the 30 by 30 a reality, to protect 30% of the planet for nature by 2030. Finally, on pollution, this continent is also under immense threat from pollution, from persistent organic pollutants to plastics. The scourge of plastics is very visible because no corner of the planet is immune to the scourge of plastic pollution. And so, again, you all have an opportunity to lead on this, to support the world in coming forward with a meaningful plastics treaty that can also protect this important continent from the scourge of plastic pollution. We just concluded the 4th session of the International Negotiating Committee for this plastics treaty. It's important that we work together through listening to the diverse voices as we continue to road towards Busan in Korea at the end of the year, to hopefully adopt, as I have said, a very meaningful plastics treaty that will also have a very important positive effect for the conservation and preservation of this continent. Let me conclude by saying that we need the diverse voices to still come together in the context of your deliberations here. We need to have these voices come together as we discuss and improve and evolve international environmental governance globally. UNEP celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2022, and we looked particularly at what could make environmental governance better in the next 50 years. And this is precisely the topic of this seminar here. How can we make sure that science is listened to, that the policy responses build on effective science and are themselves effective to deal with the responses? Because at the end of the day, all the agreements that we're discussing are only agreements. They remain text on paper until they really have an impact and have a positive effect in the lives of people and in terms of preserving our planet. And so the Antarctic Treaty Regime has been a model for this interface, and we need this Antarctic Treaty Regime with all its diverse voices to continue to be this model in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your views on the effectiveness and challenges on the Antarctic governance. So we have only about 10 minutes, but I would like to have a little bit further views from all of you, maybe 1 minute each. But for Rajik and Ivan, you have touched upon the new challenges in this new geopolitical situations. could you be more specific how science, in the case of Rajik, science can actually promote an international cooperation in the Antarctic governance context? And for Ivan, how the diplomacy can promote international cooperation in this very different geopolitical situation? Thank you.
The point has been very well elaborated by the learned speakers here, learned panelists here. Science still remains the fundamental aspect to what we people are continuing in Antarctic, and I think unless we do some meaningful science, if you go through the different scientific fields that are being pursued in Antarctic, you find that on several issues there's no unanimity. For example, what is the direct impact of the global warming on the ice sheets? We know how this is impacting the superficial or the surface, upper surface of the ice sheet, but what is happening from below? The bottom carving of the ice, the knowledge is very poor, and there's no unanimity on that. And that has got impact on the total Antarctic ecosystem. So possibly these and several other systems, like what is the bedrock topography, how it is influencing the Antarctic environment, how it is affecting the movement of the continental ice towards the ocean. So all these points, they do require some sort of international collaboration, because one single nation cannot do this. So, and these scientific aspects have got great impact on our understanding of the Antarctic. So I think this is one thing where if you do real good science on these aspects, that will impact the global policy making also.
So I guess you're asking, how does diplomacy promote cooperation? And I guess there are many possible ways, but what comes to mind at the moment in this context is the challenge of working in a consensus-based system. And that makes getting things done rather difficult. At the same time, it's also a strength of the system, because once you have all the consultative parties agree, then you have a strong basis for policy going forward. But consensus can lead to cul-de-sacs and lack of progress in a lot of different circumstances. And so good diplomacy involves trying to figure out ways of finding compromises that may require creative solutions. And that's not easy at all. It doesn't mean that governments here will come and forget about what's going on in the rest of the world. The Ukraine crisis will have an impact on decisions made in capitals that affect instructions that are given here and in all other organizations, for example. At the same time, there is a real need to find ways to cooperate for science and for other purposes, and to keep the peace in Antarctica. And to do that requires careful diplomacy, and so I think I think that is really part of it.
Thank you. So my question, the second question goes to Susie, Juan, and Arnold. Do you think the Antarctic governance, maybe I should be more specific, policy people, are really listening to science, to new voices from the Antarctic programs, and the voices from the global community represented maybe by the UNEP? And if there are to be any improvements on the part of the Antarctic governance system, how do you propose or suggest that we have more substantive engagement with the science, with the new voices from the national programs, and the diversifying voices from the global community? Thank you, Susie and Arnold and Juan. Thank you.
I think, as I was saying earlier, it is a challenge to make what is often very complicated, technical, and often quite uncertain scientific information accessible in a way that it can be acted upon by the treaty parties. I do think scientists are getting better at doing that, and I think it is being listened to. I think we saw that, for example, in the Helsinki Declaration from last year's meeting, where the importance of science, the understanding of the impacts of climate change on the Antarctic, the need to improve that understanding and also to act on it, that was very clearly recognized by the parties last year. So yes, I do think they're listening. But I think that we do have a way to go on making sure that we capture that full range of different voices, a diverse range of contributors to that science. But as I mentioned, new initiatives like the International Polar Year and Antarctica InSync, these are really good opportunities to bring in more scientific researchers. I think the big questions that we need to understand in the Antarctic are very multidisciplinary. I'm thinking of examples like the recent loss of sea ice extent. There's the physical aspect of that, the biological implications of it. We need to understand the biogeochemical processes, the links with atmospheric processes, the links not just effects in Antarctica, but right across other regions of the world as well with that influence. So these are big multidisciplinary questions, and I think bringing science together in those large multidisciplinary and international programs are a really good opportunity to try to get those messages across back into the treaty.
Thank you for the question, and I think this, for us as newcomers, as new voices, as new faces, I think we have a great opportunity to behave or to show how committed we are setting examples. Especially Colombia has already met this 30-30 commitment 2 years ago. We actually have the 32% of our country is already set in protected areas, also in the ocean. But we need to not only set that example in paper, we have to go into action. And I'm the one that is convinced that science is the very good way to make this political and decision makers provide them with the best tools to take better actions. We're committed to that. We're working in building new capacities, and we just launched a new ship to make Antarctic research, only 10 years after joining actively these Antarctic activities. But the main question is that we should work together in understanding how can we make the relationship with the environment a little bit wiser, a little bit better. And we are committed with that. I think the new voices are committed with that perspective, and we're willing to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would fully subscribe to what Susie and Juan have said. There is a good basis to build on. There are successes that we can look back on, but a very sober finding from science again would be that we're not doing enough. We're not really where we should be. And so we need to collectively find these ways how we can improve the science policy interface, how we can, as Evan has said, find these compromises that will then yield also these positive outcomes in terms of diplomacy, because we don't, as I have underlined, we don't have much more time. This is what science tells us before we reach irreversible outcomes, and I think that's not what we want. But Susie, I think, highlighted a very important point. Science needs to be also becoming much more accessible, and the digital transformation that we're all living with already, I think, provides us with opportunities in this context. Thank you.
Arnold, I'm sorry, I think the first panel's time is over now, so we'll have about 5 minutes break, so you can bring your food inside the room and rest for 5 minutes, and the second panel will start from 35, okay, with the chair, Hyun-Cho. So thank you very much for participating in the panel one. Thank you.
Yeah. Or I can just say briefly that you are a star anti-con. Can we have the panel to start it? So I will ask the panelists to come onto the stage, please. And yeah, in the speaking order, yeah. So please be seated, and then all the panelists should come onto the stage now. Microphone on, please. Yes, okay, good. All right, I think it's good time to have the panel to start it. I think in my opening earlier on, one of the things I was saying was, okay, what we are doing today in the Antarctic could be a textbook for elsewhere or other domains or for future generation. The panel to title is Our Responsibilities and Commitment. Basically, in panel one, I think we were doing issue identification and general direction and that kind of thing. In panel two, I think we will discuss specifics. As I said, if it's a textbook, then there will be always exercise, answering questions and things. So we will come down to the earth a little deeper with specific topics. Now we have 5 panelists. Professor Akio Shibata will, because he's an international lawyer, I think I will ask him put the Antarctic in a global and legal perspective and setting, and then ask naughty questions about the effectiveness of the Antarctic Treaty System. And then Russell Miles from Australian Foreign Ministry will introduce and illustrate problems and challenges and good practices toward how to deal with environmental liability. And Keith will, from University of Groningen, he will discuss and review what are the new challenges with tourism, recently upsurging activity, and how to review and examine, deal with the accumulating impacts of the tourism. And Michelle Rogan-Finemo, the Executive Secretary of COMNAP, if it is, we need muscle and arm and leg for the Antarctic activity. She is an Executive Secretary of COMNAP, and she will discuss how we do, what we do to see the Antarctic a safe place. And last not the least, Yusra, originally from Brazil, is a SCAR Anticon fellow, and she will discuss about the role of future generations. So, panelists, if there is something has to be said more, please feel free to. Akio, would you please start? Thank you.
Thank you, Yoncho. So this is actually an easier job for me to speak my own views on one of the topic of this panel, which is Antarctica in global setting, and what are our responsibilities towards the future of Antarctica. So I have two messages. One is how to strengthen the global Antarctic science, and the second message for the future of Antarctica is how to explain and demonstrate the effectiveness of the current Antarctic governance. So I'll start with the first one, strengthening the global Antarctic science. So Antarctic science has always been global in scientific context, and Antarctic governance based on the Antarctic Treaty is to support such global Antarctic science, including through cooperative working relations with the United Nations and other international organizations. This is a quote from Article 3, Paragraph 2. The development of such cooperative working relations, however, has been slow in the context of Antarctic governance framework. So according to my view, our first responsibility towards the future of Antarctic through the Antarctic Treaty System is to highlight the global scientific implications of the Antarctic science through strengthened collaborative efforts between the Antarctic scientific communities, such as SCAR and COMNAP, and on the other hand, the United Nations and other international scientific communities. And during this meeting, there are good examples of such a potential collaboration between Antarctic scientific communities and the global scientific communities. The first one is the United Nations Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And the second one is the International Year of Glaciers Preservation 2025. This is proposed by WMO and UNESCO. And in relation to this, ASOC's paper requesting for discrete consideration for possible glacial geoengineering to be applied in Antarctica should also be mentioned. The global scientific collaboration will also have favorable implications for the Antarctic Treaty System, as well as the transparency of the Antarctic scientific activities of individual nations and their scientific results can be increased through such a global collaboration. My second message, explaining and demonstrating the effectiveness of Antarctic governance. The Antarctic governance regime is a regional one and is based on its particular foundational principles, different from the United Nations or other global regimes. And those two foundational principles, according to my view, is first, the participatory rights based on substantive interest demonstrated through scientific research actually conducted in the Antarctica. And the second foundational principle is the decision-making by the consensus of all consultative parties who have demonstrated such interest in Antarctica. So, under these two foundational principles, our responsibility towards the future of Antarctica, according to my view, is to demonstrate by both words and deeds that this governance regime can and does address the current and future concerns of both the Antarctic and global communities. During this meeting, there are some agenda items which directly relate to the effectiveness of Antarctic governance. The first is how to make the three important measures to become effective and legally binding. Two measures are on tourism regulation, and one measure is on the environmental liability, Annex 6. The second, how to apply appropriate procedure for the consultative party status acknowledgement. According to my view, recognizing the participatory rights in the Antarctic governance of new nations who have demonstrated their substantive interest in Antarctica is extremely important for the legitimacy of the system. And finally, the third, how to proactively interact with global governance regimes, sometimes learning from them, sometimes demonstrating our uniqueness so as to exercise our special responsibilities in the Antarctic governance in consideration of such global regimes and interests. One example of this kind is the new BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, and its relationship with the ATS. So I'll stop here, Yuncho. Thank you.
Yeah. Difficult questions, naughty questions, like tourism, environmental liability, and participatory right in connection with global scheme. Okay, then will Russell provide us real-life cases? Would you? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hung Chung and Kiho and other panelists and participants. My name is Russell Miles. I'm the Director of the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia Antarctic section. We work very closely with our Australian Antarctic Division to implement Australia's responsibilities in Antarctica. Thank you very much for organising this important discussion on the future responsibilities and commitments, and I think this is a really important part of our discussion and work to think about what does the future of Antarctic look like and how do we help steer and shape that. Don't just let it happen by itself. I'm speaking in my presentation about Annex 6 to the Madrid Protocol, which is of course on environmental liability. Australia ran the forum on this discussion over the last 6 months, and I'm here to really report back on what some of the parties are saying about the annex and how we might be able to take that forward. This sort of discussion, I think, is really important for the future as we move forward on some of the discussions, even in this session this week, on tourism, on issues of climate change risk, safety issues. These are things that really are coming in the future and important for us to look at. So just a brief history for those who may not be aware about Annex 6. It was actually adopted over 30 years ago. 30 years since the adoption of the Madrid Protocol. But parties agreed the need for rules and procedures relating to liability of environmental damage in the Antarctic. So Annex 6 was negotiated at the ATCM 2005, and the professor here just told me that he was one of the drafters. And I actually was reading it again this morning. It's an excellent annex, I must say, from a legal perspective. But actually what's more important, I think, is that you could read it, I mean, this was 20 years ago, but you could read it today as if it had just been written. And it's still very, very relevant and actually increasingly important to see it implemented. And I think the drafters of the annex really were thinking with some foresight about the future. So it was a very good annex, and it's important for us to keep looking at ways of bringing it into force. So entry into force of Annex 6 would be indeed a large milestone for the Antarctic Treaty System, and one that I think we need to keep talking about and working towards. It won't be easy, though. I think we need to understand that these things entering into force is not an easy process. At the moment, we've got 19 of the 28 parties who were consultative parties in 2005 have approved the annex. So there's still 9 to go before we can go into force. So that's still a large percentage and a lot of countries. Of course, amongst other things, such as preventative measures and contingency planning and response action, the annex does establish financial penalties for operators who fail to take action, and I think this is probably one of the key sticking points for a lot of countries. It is our hope, of course, that we never need to use that financial penalties, and that Annex 6 itself helps to prevent environmental emergencies from ever happening because of all the other parts of the annex and that people are working on. So that idea of preventative instead of responding to action. I think the discussion of the process can be just as important as the outcome, and I think we need to keep talking about it, and that's why Australia agreed to run the forum this year. I think that forum was established to share information amongst parties, to highlight lessons, to undertake progress that have been made for domestic implementation, and those are some of the challenges that we learnt. So I just thought it important to raise a couple of the points that were discovered in the discussion. So overall, parties in the discussion reaffirmed that the support for the principles underlining Annex 6 was strong and were there. Parties shared information on the domestic implementation progress. For some, they noted that there was domestic regulatory frameworks in place, but they couldn't really be implemented until the Annex 6 was entered into force, so there's a bit of a chicken and egg issue there. Some noted that legislation in their countries were going to have to change, even to accept some of the terms in the annex, such as ecological damage, and especially for issues such as facilitating transfer of funds to an international fund. So, and as we know, legislative change is very difficult to achieve. There are a lot of questions about insurance issues, about products, about the cover that was provided, a lot of issues and questions about the requirements for tourism operators to provide evidence of that insurance or finance, and challenges with small operators in particular. And then also lastly, I think practical experience in applying Annex 6 is difficult because we haven't adopted it yet. So countries actually thinking about how they might apply it, also very difficult. So we see that sort of chicken and egg problem. But I think what we did learn from the informal session was just the value of countries sharing this information and continuing to do so. It is our feeling that I think that further discussion needs to continue. We can't just sort of end. We need to sort of keep pressing and assisting countries to join Annex 6. We also need to make sure that there is a structure to do that and that countries are able to sort of engage with each other. So in summary, I think we saw that parties really agreed to the value of Annex 6. There was a range of domestic challenges for a lot of countries, and we need to help countries work through those issues. It's not easy, but value in sharing that information. So I think the process and the discussion is actually what's important, because that will actually lead to change even before we get to Annex 6 being finally adopted, and that's actually, that process is just as important. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Antarctic tourism is by no means new, but tourism management is a new homework indeed. Kiss, please.
Does it function? Yes. Yeah, I would like to reflect on my experiences in another part of the world in relation to the effectiveness of nature conservation law. And I think such a comparison is always risky because the areas are completely different, but the phenomena and the concepts in effectiveness of law are comparable, I think. So the Wadden Sea is an area in the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark that is protected by at least 13 legal systems. It's a World Heritage Area, it is a Ramsar area, it's a Natura 2000 area, it is part of the Emerald network, it is very important for all kinds of other treaties, and it's degrading. So there is much law and very limited protection. And that has to do with the effectiveness, not with the existence of law. And I've tried to understand what the reasons might be. So there are a number of concepts and phenomena that I see worldwide in relation to effectiveness of law. First, very often we do not make, in policy making, adopt limitations at a strategic level. Very often areas are open access areas, and the main instruments are environmental impact assessment and authorities. Of course, there are exceptions to these concepts and observations, but that's very often how we try to get grip on these human activities. That means that we focus on projects, plans, individual activities, very often with fragmented competences of many different authorities. The default situation is generally that they are allowed unless they have negative impacts. And then the government very often feels the burden of proof to actually say that these impacts are unacceptable. The result is that we very often authorize these activities. We apply permit conditions, but they do not more than damage control. So limit the effects. But because of the total number of activities increase, the cumulative impacts are the problem. And we see that in all parts of the world. Very often also, if activities are already allowed, they turn to a sort of right to continue conducting these activities, and we are very reluctant to limit existing activities. And these concepts of phenomena result in accumulation of impacts. A process of certain and slow degradation is the result of that. And this process is also accumulating with other cumulative problems, like climate change, pollution, the introduction of non-native species, etc. So it's an accumulation not only of effects of plans and projects, but also an accumulation of cumulative problems, in fact. A further concept that is recognizable in many areas is that we have actually a very limited understanding of these cumulative impacts. We have also a limited, consistent monitoring, so we actually are not fully aware of what is going on in many places. And a next concept that is actually related to that is that there is difficulties valuing the described environmental changes. And that has to do with shifting baselines. New people come in and they have different views on what is serious or what is not. Because very often their baseline is their starting moment in the job, etc. And also because monitoring is lacking. And on top of that, we have weak supervision and enforcement. This is what I see in the Wadden Sea, in many other areas in the world. And it is, in fact, resulting in much law and very limited protection. And then towards what we can learn from that. And I think that strengthening environmental impact assessment and authorization processes are important, particularly the role of the precautionary principle, for instance, but they will not result in firm solutions. It will have a limited effect because of the very strong characteristics of the things that I mentioned. Important is also to work on a better understanding of cumulative impact and strengthen monitoring. So very important, but often very time-consuming, and the outcomes might be too late. And I refer also to the comments by UNEP explaining that there is an urgency in relation to these three crises. So I think that if we want to take Article 2 and 3 of the protocol seriously, and we really want to protect the Antarctic as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science, and implement comprehensive, effective environmental protection, then we should not only look at the how are we conducting activities, but also to what. What is it that we want to allow in the Antarctic? Also to the where. Where do we want to have these activities implemented? Choices in relation to spatial choices, planning. Do we need reference areas, etc.? And also choices in how much. Do we need more research stations? Is there a maximum to that at some point? Is there a maximum number of visitors? All kind of aspects that we actually did not really make bold policy choices in. And I think, and that's my last comment, that that is very important to consider to be fair to future generations, where Joostra will talk more about. Fairness towards future generations relates to humankind, but also to nature and nature itself. And that is probably also why in the world rights of nature is getting more and more attention, because of these limitations of the effectiveness of the many laws, treaties and European directives that we have. I think people are getting impatient and try to actually have innovative processes in our legal systems. They also relate to the Antarctic discussions, as we know, and I think we have to take these discussions serious as well. Thank you.
Michel, safety issues.
How to use the microphone should have been my first instructions. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Rogan-Finnimore. I've been invited to talk to you today about safety. This isn't a COMNAP opinion on safety. This is my own view. And when I was asked to talk about safety on this panel, I thought, well, I don't really think that safety is a future challenge. It's here in the present. It's been part of our conversation for decades, really, especially within the national Antarctic programs. And even within the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, safety has been an important issue and has been discussed since 1963, when the first meeting of experts on telecommunications took place. So safety isn't new, and it's not something we should save for the future. It's something we should all participate in now. So when we think of safety in the context of Antarctica, we often think about outcomes of our actions related to activities on, for example, sea ice, or in crevassed land ice, at sea in vessels, in or around helicopter or aircraft operations. And we think about situations where someone in the Antarctic might require medical assistance, or we might have to be involved in an emergency search and rescue response. And many parts of our community play a role in the safety response and coordination. And in fact, national Antarctic programs have forever been the implementer of a safety response in consultation with their contractors, their militaries, and with the rescue coordination centers that have responsibilities over parts of the Antarctic. But now we're seeing sort of new challenges or new definitions of safety that are being introduced into our system. We're seeing some emerging external challenges related to how we keep people safe in the Antarctic. And these are things like, how do you keep a whole continent COVID-19 free? Very challenging situation we were presented with. Now we're looking at bird flu. How do we keep people safe from coming in contact with wildlife that have carried this virus to the Antarctic? So having acknowledged that safety encompasses a broad range of issues, I would like to note that I am no safety expert, and I'm looking out here in the audience and I'm seeing many people who are safety experts. I see people within the National Antarctic Programs, within the IATO membership, within contractors to the National Antarctic Programs, in military support units, and within the 5 rescue coordination centers that have responsibility over portions of the Antarctic, who are experts in safety and safety-related issues. And we already have a range of tools and protocols within the Antarctic Treaty System that are applicable to safety. So I think the question is, are those tools scalable? Can we scale those up to the evolving and the diversifying activities that we're seeing in the Antarctic? We work together as a community to make sure that on a regular basis we are addressing our safety challenges that may present in the Antarctic. This includes our regular SAR workshops. It also includes representatives from the whole community, including the tourism and, don't forget, the fishery community. So there are at least those 3 different sets of actors in the Antarctic at any period of time: the fisheries communities, the tourism communities, and the governmental operators. And they always work together to discuss and apply lessons learned from recent incidents, accidents, and near misses, so that we can constantly do better and support each other to have a good outcome in the event that something goes wrong. So everyone plays a role in their own personal safety, and national Antarctic programs promote that through education, training, and establishment of systems to support safety in Antarctica. And again, I think what we have to understand is whether those systems are scalable. We carry out risk assessments in order to identify, mitigate, or eliminate the hazards and dangers that we identify and that are specific to our areas of operations, because the Antarctic is a big place. So what may apply in one place may not apply or work in another. There is an austere level of medical equipment and expertise in the Antarctic. So any increased level of activity down there will put pressure on those systems. And there's these huge distances that need to be covered. So it's not like if you break your leg in your own home, it's going to take you a long time to get medical assistance, no matter where you are in the Antarctic. And then on top of all that, on top of what we do in the Antarctic and here in the treaty system, for each of the national Antarctic programs, they have their own domestic laws and legislations that they must adhere to. And there's a lot of safety rules and regulations as well. So I guess my take-home message is there's no one-size-fits-all for when we talk about safety in Antarctica, probably because of the depth and breadth of the topic and the enormity of the area we are active in. And we have to recognize there are differences in operations and differences in national legislations and protocols. So I think that's all I want to say on safety, thanks.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Yosra. I'm a PhD candidate at Wageningen University, and I'm from Brazil. As I'm speaking here in this panel, the southern region of my home country, the state of Rio Grande do Sul, have been experiencing extreme flooding for the last 3 weeks. More than 500,000 people have been displaced from their homes, and more than 150 have lost their lives. Extreme flooding is not common in that region, but the effects of climate change are becoming more frequent and more intense. I'm talking here about Brazil, but I could talk about Venezuela, who became last week the first country in the Andes to lose all its glaciers. I could talk about the country I live now, the Netherlands, and future sea rise projections. Or I could talk about many other examples. I'm sure you can all think about some of them. As I hope everyone here knows, the polar regions play a crucial role in regulating the world's climate. And we heard this in the previous panel, and we heard this many, many times. What happens in the post does not stay in the post. As I was asked to be a representative of the future generation and speak about the responsibilities of the current generation towards the future of Antarctica, I need to stress that we live in times of urgency. The decisions taken at the HCCM today are going to impact the world that we inherit tomorrow, the world that your kids inherit tomorrow. And I believe there are 3 main points when we're talking about future responsibilities of current people to the HCCM. The first one, it is both in the preamble of the treaty and the protocol that Antarctica should be governed for the benefits of all humankind. This guiding principle must inform every decision taking at the HCCM, and decision makers have a collective responsibility to ensure this. The second is the HCCM needs to move from reactive management and from decision making by non-decision making, because we cannot afford to postpone critical decisions, and parties need to work together. They need to collaborate. We have a lot of science. We have a lot of research that decision makers need to listen to and take decisions based on that. And the third one is in face of uncertainty or lack of scientific evidence, the ATCM needs to rely on a precautionary approach because we cannot risk to get to the points of damages that are irreversible. I recognize that many decisions that affect Antarctica are not taken at the ATCM, they are taking different forums. But decision makers here are responsible for ensuring that the decisions made within the ATCM reflect a commitment to the continent and its protection. And remember that decisions here do not only impact the ATCM parties, but the whole world. To conclude, I would just like to echo Elena Gualinga's opening speech from the ATCM last year in Finland, where she said that we count on decision makers to have the ambition to leave us the legacy we deserve and need for our survival. Thank you very much.
I can only agree with Michelle that there is nothing like a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not easy, it's complex, but wary of the time left, why don't I just pose the questions that I was going to ask you anyway, all together, and ask each panelist to respond. Now, the current stance or response of consultative parties towards Annex 6, also tourism regulation. How can you persuade this is a top priority? And in fact, there is a way to make this progress a little quicker. So I would like you to make comments on that. And then the interaction between tourism and safety. Is there anything like that? Or is there any way to make the interaction or collaboration between non-governmental entities and national programs? Is there any way to improve this more? And thirdly, then what is the role for the future generation and what kind of opportunity path will you seek of future generation on the issue of Antarctic governance? So each panelist, say a few words, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joel. Yes. So I'll take on the first topic that you have mentioned. How important is it for the Antarctic Treaty System to address the environmental liability Annex 6 and the tourism issues? According to my view, the Antarctic Treaty System has been very successful in addressing a specific problem on the ground. And the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties were successful in coming to, number one, that is the problem, and then number two, that they know how to address it by having the consensus on it. So it's a building block type of addressing the issues. And so from that perspective, I think, as I have said in my talk, that entering into force of those three measures, which is 10 years ago, that the consultative parties all agreed that those two measures on tourism, which regulates on the number of landing persons from the same ship, and having the mandatory contingency planning and also mandatory insurance for the tourist people. So those are the very important building blocks to regulate Antarctic tourism. Back then, 2004 and 2009, and we have spent almost 20 years how to implement them. And I think it's too long. And the same goes with the environmental liability. We spent 10 years negotiating the Annex 6. And then we spent 20 years already to approve the Annex 6. Of course, there are several difficulties depending on some of the countries, but do we really need 20 years to implement one annex, which is of course complex, but we spent already 20 years for implementation. So for the effectiveness of the regime, it is very important that we show, that demonstrate it is effective by agreeing to the new rules and making them legally enforceable. So we need double consensus, the consensus for the adoption and the consensus for those measures to become approvable. But I think we can demonstrate that this system works by consensus, having those two consensus on those three issues. The tourism, I think now we are considering this a comprehensive and consistent framework on the tourism. It's not a building block type of addressing the issues. I think I mean, the consultative parties need to come to an agreement that it is a needed approach, and then I think the consultative parties will have the wisdom how to address that common interest that they have agreed. Thank you.
Thank you. I just should say that this is definitely my own opinion, not that of the Australian government, as you said at the beginning. But, I mean, the Antarctic Treaty System is one of the longest-standing, very successful treaties. We talk about that a lot. And it is very good at responding or reacting to sort of things that was happening. But I think as our panelist here was saying, like, things are changing more quickly now in the world, in the context of Antarctica, and the rate of change and the rate of different things that are happening is really increasing, and I think the Antarctic Treaty System, to survive and to do well, needs to sort of increase this rate of change in terms of decision making as well. I think we have successfully sort of had a fairly steady state approach, but there's this need to sort of think about how do we move things more quickly is really sort of quite critical, I think. But also we are a consensus system, I think, as Evan was saying earlier, that how do you then make the consensus system work in that type of need? You still need to have a consensus, but you need to be able to move more quickly. So it's quite a challenge, but I think it's something that we need to look at. The other point, I think, is with Article 6 is on the domestic implementation. So Australia took 7 years to put it through our sort of domestic processes. A lot of that is based on all sides of government agreeing to approve the legislation, and I think in a lot of the countries, that comes by building consensus across political sort of divide. It means bringing your public along in that discussion, so you do that through more information or more knowledge, awareness raising of the general public, so that the parliamentarians then get behind those decisions. I mean, the Parliament only makes the decision of the people generally, in democracies, I guess. So, so more information, I think, to parliamentarians to help that domestic process would certainly help. And then, as I said, I think using the forum that we've got to share information better to make sure that people have got the information they need to help make those process changes.
Thank you for your excellent questions. I would like to combine two of the three questions, so reflect on future generations and the tourism dossier. I think that Edith Brown Rice, a professor of the US in 1988 to 1990, she had different papers on fairness to future generations. And what she explained is that fairness to future generations relates to keeping options open similar to the options that we have. And that actually implies that we are also ensure fairness to nature, because nature is very important to have these options. And I think for the Antarctic, that is a very inspiring statement, as inspiring as well as what Josra said about the position of that future generation. And I think quite characteristics of, for instance, the SEALS Convention, but also CROMRA, and some other decisions made in the Antarctic Treaty System is proactiveness, making sure we have decisions made before the activities really happen. We didn't do that for tourism, although already in 1992 there was a proposal for an annex to the protocol on Antarctic tourism. So we lagged behind on that dossier, and the proof is actually increasing on the effects. This year, 122,000 tourists in the Antarctic. So I think it's urgently time to ensure that options, keeping options open, is ensured by taken responsibility as a state system.
Well, I'm hoping the safety question was directed to me and not the liability or the more tricky question. So I'm taking the safety questions. And I think your question was along the lines of how I see the interaction between tourist groups and national Antarctic programs on the topic of safety. We regularly consider scenarios that involve the national Antarctic programs, their military, their commercial contractors, and tourism with their aircraft and vessels, and also with fisheries in our SAR workshops and in the regular tabletop and real-life exercises that are carried out. And so, again, it's not a new activity to consider the interaction between these different actors on the topic of safety. It's a question of scale. These practical exercises have worked very well to identify gaps and to highlight problems in process related to coordination or implementation of a response when something goes wrong. No matter what we do, we still have these challenges related to distance. It's a huge place we're talking about. And now we may have a challenge related to number of people that may be involved in a single incident. That would be slightly new. We have had some larger accidents. But national Antarctic programs have always, if they can, acted in a response to an emergency. Some national Antarctic programs have recently sent their vessel to assist fisheries or fishing boats that have been in trouble. So again, not a new activity, but it's how we, or can we, scale that up, and can we respond? And I think in addition to the national Antarctic programs and the tourism and the fishery communities themselves, there's a huge role to play here with the countries who are involved in permitting the activity, the tourism activity. There's also a role that the gateway communities can play, with most of the tourism activity now coming out of the South American gateways and being focused on the northern Antarctic Peninsula. So again, we can't always talk about the Antarctic when we talk about these issues. We may have to look regionally. And then I guess all I want to say is, I think we should also consider what might happen if tourism continues to grow, but not through IATA. National Antarctic Program research starts to want to be done by private entities on the continent. So there could be this new dynamic happening with different actors involved in what might be seen as lucrative or beneficial activity. I think that's something we should think about.
Thank you. I think that's a hard question because you ask what is the role of future generations in Antarctic governance, and the long-term impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, they are going to disproportionately affect younger generations. Future generations are the one that actually will bear the consequences of actions and inactions in the Antarctic Treaty Governance System. And I believe that youth and early career researchers are not nowadays more ambitious, we are less patient, but it's just because we cannot afford to be patient. We are, everyone keeps saying, like, we're like in this rapidly changing environments. So for us, it's very hard to see how we're not moving towards more, doing more, and so on. I don't think it's our role to educate senior generations about the sense of urgency, because I think this should be parts of everyone that signed, became a party to the treaty, became a party to the protocol. There are values and principles that parties subscribe when they became parties that they should consider in all their decisions. But I do hope that we can inspire at least senior generations to understand the sense of urgency we're talking about. Thank you.
Very much. I think I was overly ambitious in two aspects. The first one is to trying to package all these important topics into 2-hour capsule. And second one is, I was even thinking of inviting 3 questions from the floor, but I think I cannot do that because I was determined to let you go back to your work exactly by 2:30. So I will just have to close it. But I have some important things to say regarding the future of this seminar. Okay, let me close the session. If opening is a delight and an honor, and closing is a privilege. 2 hours have so quickly passed, and we learned a lot from a range of perspectives. I think we have been reaffirmed of the 3 things at least. First is significance of peaceful cooperation based on science. And secondly, the value of conserving this unique place, using that science for future generation and for the future planet. And thirdly, the necessity of making science and policy talk to each other in understandable way with a view to generating effective mechanisms and institutions. We certainly hope to see the Antarctic that is conserved, see the Antarctic that is valued, and see the Antarctic that is appreciated. That Antarctic should be a safe place to work in, for example, to undertake research that leads to exciting discoveries and to serve societal utilities. The Antarctic that we would like to secure is where environmental liability never becomes a real-life concern, and at least there is a plan that is ready to go in response and in implementation. We would like to ensure there is a workforce for the future ready, and we all know that it will take time and diligence on the part of all parties and stakeholders involved. In wrapping up, I would say there will be no tomorrow where Antarctic is less important than it is today. I found that this kind of not quite official forum, yet assisted by experts and wisdoms assembled thanks to this ATCM. This is useful and helpful. I will look forward to us continuing with this tradition. At least Kobe University and Korea Polar Research Institute will remain committed. Once again, I gratefully acknowledge the efforts and dedication to make this seminar a success for all those who contributed like this, and locally here and from other locations. In particular, Professor Akio Shibata, Dr. Rahul Mohan, and Rocket, everyone. Before I finish and close, allow me to make one promotional statement. KOPRI and Kobe University's Polar Cooperation Research Center are planning to hold a second international workshop on Antarctic governance in Kobe, Japan, around December 1st, this coming December 1st this year. We will invite and welcome speakers and discussants, and details can be supplied later either by me or by Professor Shibata. And thank you very much. The class is dismissed. Thank you.